here. Yes, perfect.
No more music.
No more music. Now it's only your sound. Yeah, so welcome. You are the second one. We had a very good start. We're sure it will continue. And I'm actually super excited that you are part of the track where I am, because I am always hacking on how to do more with less. So I'm looking forward. Yes, so Gojko, also not the first time in Devternity, right? So many know you, and you're author of many great books. And
Thank you very much.
Yes, and yeah, so the stage is yours, and you will share with us how to do more with less and how to really achieve the impact.
So first of all, thanks everybody who's kind of in this track. It's very weird to do remote conferences where I can't see you, but hopefully you will enjoy this. The topic today is really how to create great outcomes with our software and not spend too much doing that. I'm currently building my own product. It's called Narrakit, and it is a product that helps developers create narrated videos quickly from Markdown and keep it in version control and things like that, so you can automate kind of all sorts of video building. And it's really been a wonderful journey where kind of I'm more or less the only person doing it, and I'm coming close to about 1 million active users per month. And that's kind of, you know, the effect we can get if we focus on maximizing impact and minimizing effort. Before building my own products, I used to work as a consultant, and I had a couple of other companies. And one thing that really was a fundamental change in my career when I was a CTO about 17 years ago, I think, or something like that, where I mean, at that point, I think we had the best technical team I've ever worked with. Absolutely. Even to this day, we had stuff that people are only now adopting. Back then, we had continuous delivery before the continuous delivery book came out. We were deployed on AWS in 2008. So an early adopter of the cloud. We had all sorts of really wonderful technical practices. But the company ran out of money, and the company ran out of money because we were not building the right things. And there was a big slap in the face for me. I wasn't really taking a salary there, so I almost ran out of money by doing that. And this became a big kind of question: how on earth could have we been so stupid in one kind of direction and so smart in another direction? So that, you know, we had all these wonderful technical practices, but effectively we were just burning money very quickly. And that kind of got me set me on a journey to figure out how do other companies solve this problem. And I've been kind of researching that ever since, because there's some wonderful things there. So I want to give you a couple of conclusions from that. One of the things that I'll also talk about is this technique of impact mapping that was invented by a Swedish interaction design agency to kind of solve this problem of preventing people from creating failed IT projects. And for the last couple of years, a colleague and I have been interviewing organizations on how they do impact mapping effectively. So I'll give you some conclusions from that. We're kind of writing a book, and these are some early conclusions how to actually kind of get some big effects of that. So one of the big issues that we had back then in like 2007, 2008, when the company was running out of money, was that really we could not figure out very quickly what we're doing wrong, and if we're doing something right or if we're doing something wrong. And this is because fundamentally, if we look at business value or if we look at goals and things like that, there's kind of two types of planning and two types of value delivery in software projects. We have these big value ticket items, that some things that kind of change on a month's basis, or something that you can achieve in 6 months, in a year. Those are kind of these big business goals, big meaty, big ticket items, big objectives. And then this kind of smaller stuff that we do week after week. There's something that allows us to figure out what should we do next week, what should we plan after this. And there's usually a big disconnect between the two because they're not really easy to track. Most organizations today, at least based on my experience as a consultant while I was still doing consulting, have the technical capability of adjusting their plans on this schedule. Like every week, every 2 weeks, we have, people have iterations, they have flow, they can stop and say, look, what we've just done wasn't useful. Let's throw it away, let's start with something else. Or what we've just done isn't such a high priority, something else happened that's a much higher priority because the market changed, let's do this other thing instead. But most organizations don't actually benefit from their technical capability of doing that. Because the way we plan or the way people plan business value and prioritize is still very much focused on kind of these types of goals. And that's a big issue. So when we talk about kind of two different types of value or 2 different types of goals or 2 different types of planning, stuff that people really consider business value on one hand are things like doubling revenue, reducing regulatory risk, reducing operational costs, increasing profitability. And these things are insanely valuable, but it's very, very, very unlikely that a single user story or a single task or one thing you do this week is going to create a big difference on any of these things. And that's why it's so difficult to understand and track and predict what we're doing and whether we're doing the right thing or not. This company I used to be a CTO of, we had like wonderful ideas we wanted to implement, but it takes 3 months of adding different things until we actually see the results, because like protecting our market share or increasing revenue, they're not going to come just from a single line of code or a single thing that we deploy. They work on a much smaller scale, and that's perfectly fine. We just need to figure out how do we plan these things better. On kind of a lower level thing where we have something we can control week after week, there's a totally different set of questions that people often want to answer. So one of the things we need to figure out is, is this thing that we've done this week a good idea? What should we do next? Are we investing too much in this area of the system, or should we be investing more? Should we be removing a feature or should we be adding a feature? That's kind of quite a big challenge to figure out. So one of the people that really figured out how to do this is Mark Schwartz. He wrote a wonderful book called The Art of Business Value. And the book he describes kind of a project done for a department of the US government where they were actually trying to kind of figure out to hit a specific date on when some legislation was changing. And in order to do that, they had to re-engineer a big part of their system. And so the big value is actually kind of hitting this date for legislation that's going to come in a year or 2 years. But figuring out, are we doing too little or too much on a week-by-week basis is really difficult. So what they've been able to do is they've been able to figure out something that is measurable on a smaller time scale, something that is a leading indicator of value, and that was how many cases a human caseworker can process per day. So that wasn't measuring whether they're delivering a solution, that was measuring whether they're solving a problem. Because in order to be ready for this kind of legislation when it comes, human caseworkers had to be able to process many more cases per day. So they had a starting point, they had a finish point, and then every week, every 2 weeks, whatever they delivered, they measured whether people are processing more cases per day now. If yes, they are delivering value. If no, either they're gold plating or they're delivering the wrong features and things like that. So they were able to use that as a link between the 2 levels of delivery, which I found quite kind of phenomenal as an idea. And that's one of the things that we really need to figure out. How do we kind of do this in a more systematic way? Because for lots of organizations, this stuff kind of what's being delivered week after week, the way we measure whether that's valuable or not is generally not systematically defined. people get feedback from their stakeholders and then try to ask, well, was this useful? Is this good? Is this not good? And there's a really interesting case study for something like that from the UK public broadcaster, the British BBC, where a couple of years ago, they started on this project to make the video player more personalized. And by the end of the project, they spent £70 million, then shut it down because it delivered no value. And because this was a publicly funded, BBC is funded with public money, the government's National Audit Office got involved to figure out how can you possibly spend £70 million on something that delivers no value. Why didn't you notice that sooner? And the conclusion is phenomenal. I'll kind of paste the link to the research in the Slack after this. The conclusion is basically that they could mislead themselves for so long because the project was agile. And what that meant was whatever they delivered every month, the stakeholders could say it was valuable. So they had this effectively insane process where the same people who are providing requirements are evaluating at the end whether what was delivered was valuable. And kind of there's a whole wrong set of incentives there. Nobody's going to admit that they requested something that's stupid or that doesn't provide business value. So whatever they delivered was always valuable until the project was stopped because it delivered no value. And there's a really great explanation for something like this in Don Reinertsen's book, The Principles of Product Development Flow. Don Reinertsen talks about how it's very popular to say that the only way you can judge if what we're delivering value in a product is to kind of ask an informed customer about it. And that's the reason why that is like that is because these big ticket things like revenue, market share, regulatory risk, the stuff we can really kind of evaluate and measure, they change on a much smaller scale. So you deliver a user story, you go to a stakeholder and say, hey, you know, what do you think about this? And they say, yeah, and everybody's fine. But Don says that this is kind of economically incorrect and dangerous. It's economically incorrect because it's not really based on anything. It's just somebody's gut feel. And it's dangerous because it can mislead people to kind of run around in circles and spend so much more money than they should. That's totally pointless. A friend of mine worked for a medical software company where they were rewriting software to help doctors' assistants schedule appointments. And they started with kind of this big idea of what they're going to do. Then they did a few admin screens. They showed it to the doctor's assistants. The assistant said, oh, this is brilliant, but now we need 3 more fields. And then they showed them a new version. Oh, this is brilliant, but now we need the patient history. And, oh, this is brilliant, but now we need this. And for 9 months, they were adding things to admin screens until one of the stakeholders said, okay, you know, can we put the software live? So, well, not really, because all we have are admin screens. Well, that's insane. Like, why did you only do admin screens for 9 months? Well, we were talking to kind of your stakeholders and your business users, and they were changing requirements. So we're agile, we adapt. And effectively what they've done is they've wasted 9 months running around in circles because it wasn't possible for them to say when to stop gold plating this. And that's kind of a big challenge for lots and lots of organizations. So one of the things that they've done after is to figure out, well, what's actually kind of some indicator that we're solving a problem, not that we're delivering a solution. And they came up with 2 indicators. One indicator was that the doctors will see more patients per day. The big problem with the old planning software was if somebody cancels or if something unexpected happens, doctors have big gaps in the schedule. The other indicator of what's going to happen if kind of the software is successful, if it solves a problem, is that patients will see a doctor sooner in average because they'll reach kind of their time slot sooner. Knowing these 2 things, what they've done is instead of building all these crazy admin screens, they started working on a shared calendar that was allowing admin assistants to kind of put appointments in and then maybe collect some additional information different way. And that completely changed the value delivery of this. So a way to look at this thing more systematically, and this is kind of explained much better than I could ever do that, is explained in a book, 4 Disciplines of Execution. 4 Disciplines of Execution is a book about how successful organizations work differently from those that are not that successful, especially in terms of getting value from executing on their plans. Now, if you've read modern product management books, you're probably going to know or kind of get a good feel for everything that's in the book, but I still recommend you read it because they have an amazing terminology. And they've clarified their thinking so much that kind of you can use that terminology to work with your stakeholders, you can use that terminology to work with your customers, and it will help you speed up the process. So in 4 Disciplines of Execution, unsurprisingly, they came up with 4 big differences between teams that are, organizations that are really successful and those that are not. And they've narrowed it down to kind of these 4 things. So the first is kind of focus on the really important stuff, which sounds like, yes, of course. That's kind of obvious, but a big issue really with lots of organizations these days is it's difficult to know what's the really important stuff, and it's difficult to provide that focus. That's why kind of, we were running around in circles, not really knowing what contributes to the revenue or market share, and we were not really able to execute on our plans that way. The same way this kind of medical software company, they were kind of running around in circles. They were doing admin screens because their admin assistants, the business users, were working on admin screens and asking about changes there, instead of really focusing on delivering and solving a problem. Now, the second practice is really important. The second practice is the one that unlocks a lot of these things. And the second practice is the one that most software teams have a problem with. And that's kind of acting on leading measurements, figuring out leading indicators of value, something that changes week after week, not 6 months after we deliver. And one of the things they talk about in the book is how everybody knows 6 months after you finish your project or 6 months after you've delivered something, whether that delivered value or not. I can deploy this thing and then 6 months later, I will see, did it increase my revenue? I mean, significantly or not? Did we get better market share or not? But it's too late to change our plans. If we need to change our plans, we need to find leading indicators of value. So that's where the number of cases processed by a human per day help. That's where getting the average duration between a scheduled appointment and when the patient sees a doctor helped. That's where the kind of average number of patients a doctor sees per day helped. All these things are measuring a leading indicator of whether we're delivering value or not, whether we're solving a problem or not, whether we're delivering a solution. And then kind of they talk about how this information needs to be published. This information needs to be put out there so that people can use it to delegate decision making, so that people can use it to understand on their own whether their work is bringing value or not. And lots of organizations, when they have even kind of objectives and key results and things that's not really communicated to everybody. So the last practice they have is creating a cadence of accountability. Every 2 weeks, every month, every something, review really these leading indicators, figure out if what we're doing is valuable or not, and if not, change the plan. And that's kind of the way to avoid this whole mess of spending 70 million without delivering anything. Now, I mentioned kind of this second practice is the one that really is a problem for lots of software teams, because the way we track things is insane. As an industry, the way we track things is insane. Doug Hubbard, in his book, How to Measure Anything, another wonderful book on business measurements and things like that, talks about the IT measurement inversion. And he wrote a kind of extract of that for the CIO magazine. You'll get a link to this later. And he says that especially in IT projects, there's a total inverse proportion between how valuable something is to measure and how often it gets measured. He said that often people in IT projects tend to measure shit that's easy to measure instead of measuring things that are important. And he says that kind of things that reduce uncertainty for return on investment are very, very rarely represented in metrics. So when I was working as a consultant, most teams I would get engaged with were tracking delivery through something like story points or function points or something like that, which is totally insane. because we're not delivering story points. We are spending story points. Story points are related to effort. And more story points means that we've made our software more complicated. Story points are something we invest, we spend, we burn in order to get some value, but nobody's really looking at value. And that's a big issue. And we were not looking at value with this kind of other company. So figuring this thing out is really, really critical. And one of the things that we need to know as a leading indicator, and one of the questions we need to answer is, are we really going the right direction or not? So I'd like to start with that question. Like, how do we tell next week? How do we tell a week after we deliver something or a day after we deliver something? Are we going the right direction? What can we measure? What can we find out to tell us if this is worth doing or not? If this is something that's actually delivering value, should we keep investing in it or not? And that's kind of the main sticking point, I think, for implementing something like 4 disciplines of execution software, figuring this thing. And one of the things I really want you to kind of think about, if you can, after this, is kind of whatever process metrics you have. The big question is, what are we using them for? Are we using them for tracking whether we're delivering a solution, whether we're shipping stuff, or tracking whether we're solving a problem for people? Because these two things are totally not the same. We can ship and ship and ship and ship and ship, and it could be completely useless. And lots of people often do that. But if we want to get maximum impact for minimum effort, really, we need to track if we're solving a problem. And this is kind of an issue because how we are describing our increments of work often does not allow us to track that. The most popular way of structuring work these days seems to be the Connextra user story format. So that's something like this. As a blah, blah, in order to blah, blah, I want blah, 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 blah. And the interesting thing here is what here would tell us if we're going the right direction. After I create this export to Excel, how would I know that it's not too little or not too much? How would I know that it's the right thing to do? And one of the problems kind of with something like this is that usually in a description like this, there's nothing really to tell us whether we're going the right direction, because this does not describe a direction. In the wonderful book, What Customers Want, Anthony Ulrich talks about the same problem, and this kind of created the whole jobs to be done thing later. And he talked about the project he was leading at IBM, that was the PC Junior, that was completely customer driven. They were doing focus groups, user research, and spent hundreds of millions building something that nobody wanted to buy later. And his one of the conclusions in the book is that kind of plans based on the type of work are really difficult to know if we're doing too little or too much, because they don't have a specific outcome. So what we need here is not a type of work, not a job, but we need an outcome. We need a change to that type of work that we can then measure and observe. And we need to know what that change is expected. So in 4 disciplines of execution, they talk about how successful organizations tend to have only 2 ways of tracking this. And the first is unblocking or completing a critical task. So in this case, if people are totally not able to detect inactive users now, then enabling them to do that is valuable. But in much, much more common case, yes, they can already do that. They can look at a database, they can sit next to a user, they can look at their kind of churn and things like that. So it's not the kind of unblocking or completing that task, it's actually changing somebody's behavior. So if you remember one thing from this talk that's really going to kind of help you, the next time you see a story like this, try to figure out what is the change in this behavior that's supposed to happen because of this. And then we can talk about, well, maybe it's going to be faster, or is it going to be more accurate, or is it going to be cheaper, or is it going to be more proactive? Because when we have the expected change, we have a direction where this is supposed to go. And then I can deliver the Excel export, and I can measure if people are detecting inactive users faster. Plus, An implementation of this that gets it faster might be totally different from an implementation of this that gets it sooner, or that gets it more accurate, or that gets it cheaper. And if we have a story like this without the expected change, we don't really know what the export is supposed to deliver. But if we know that it's supposed to be faster, we have a direction, we can measure if we're going in that direction. And that's really, really important, because that gives us this leading indicator of value. So all of these case studies I mentioned so far, kind of the Mark Schwartz's project, they were looking at, are humans processing more cases per day? In this medical research thing, they were talking about, are patients seeing a doctor sooner? Or are doctors seeing more patients per day? Those are behavior changes. Those are changes, there's a clear direction, and we can observe that. Behavior changes are excellent as a leading indicator of value, because they measure whether we're solving a problem, not whether we're delivering a solution. They exist outside of a software. Behavior changes are excellent as a way of looking at this stuff, because we can objectively observe this on many different levels. I can put metrics in production to measure this for millions of people, or I can go and invite one user to sit next to me and try to do it with this Excel report, and I can measure the time. We can do it with users before we deploy. We can do it with users after we deploy. We can do lots of really interesting things with that. But what's critical is we can start spotting behavior changes much, much sooner than we can spot revenue, market share, and things like that. And we can see if it's going the right direction. Is it changing at all? And that's kind of what's really important about this. So that brings me to another really kind of critical thing we kind of established from all the interviews that we've done for the new book, is really successful orgs that get a lot of value for kind of maximum impact for minimum effort don't slice deliverables. They kind of, if you have 3 months of work you want to do, you don't approach it like, okay, we do this bit and this bit and this bit because technically it makes sense, it's cheaper to do it this way. What they look at is solving smaller problems. And that's another kind of really interesting thing when we have behavior changes as a measurement of value. We can say, look, this is supposed to be 20% faster in 2 months. Well, let's make it 2% faster this week. It's a smaller problem, it's still valuable. Let's make it 10% faster by the end of this month. Let's make it 15% faster by the end of the second month. And then we can solve smaller problems. We can attack this so that every time we do this, we deliver value, and we can see if it's going the right direction, we can package the right things. And that leads me to kind of another really important thing. When we start slicing problems, there's a danger that we can start running around in circles, and we solve smaller problems, the smaller problems, the smallest problems, but we only do local optimizations, and we never deliver anything big. We don't deliver kind of the revenue at the end. We just solve a bunch of smaller problems. And the other kind of counterpart to this is that as we are slicing this thing to solve smaller problems, we need to create a sequence or a set of smaller problems that really leads to something big, something important. And then we can measure if these smaller problems are actually leading to this big important thing. This is where kind of this visualization that the Swedish interaction design agency INUSE invented comes in, and it's called an impact map. An impact map helps us visualize all these assumptions and helps us visualize these connections in a way that makes sense. And it's easy to use, it's easy to organize, it's easy to work with. And an impact map is kind of a hierarchy like this. It has this big important business goal, something that we want to achieve in 6 months or 3 months over there. And then in the middle, it has leading indicators of value. It has behavior changes where if we create these behavior changes, there's a reasonable assumption we will achieve this goal. And then to these behavior changes, we can link deliverables, user stories, epics, items of work. And then we can say, look, if we do these 2 stories, we have an assumption that we will get superfans with mobile devices to come back more frequently. And we can measure this. We can see then, is this happening after story 1 and story 2? If yes, brilliant. If not, we need to do something else. If we put some number on this, like come back 10% more frequently, and I have 20 stories here, then I can say, look, the first 3 stories achieved 20%. I don't need to do the other stories in this hierarchy. I can replan faster. Impact maps are a phenomenally quick and easy way to organize this kind of thinking and to work with stakeholders. Because they're visual, they're kind of intuitive, and we can quickly create this to map out our assumptions. So I want to kind of start wrapping this thing up and just give you a couple of ideas how to use impact maps more successfully from kind of the research we're doing. One of the things that's really important is to differentiate between kind of what we put where, and lots of people make kind of mistakes, and that prevents them from using this whole kind of 4 disciplines of execution thing effectively. We have deliverables, that's the stuff we do. Then we have leading indicators of value, and we have this really big important thing we want to focus on. So one of the key things to look at is that deliverables should really be inside our zone of control, and the impacts should be in our sphere of influence. William Detmer in the logical thinking process talks about 3 different levels of systems. He says the systems within your zone of control, this is where when you decide to do something, that thing will be done. So if we decide to build a mobile app or migrate to the cloud, more or less that will be done. That's within our zone of control. And then he says there's things that are in your sphere of influence where you might or might not be able to achieve something even with your best efforts. So if we want to get people to come back more frequently, we can do lots of stuff, but maybe they're not going to come back more frequently for whatever reason. They have their own opinions, they have their own kind of free will. So the best thing to do is kind of use impacts to put stuff that's within your sphere of influence, use deliverables for the stuff that's within your zone of control, and then you can measure the outcome of this and you can visualize assumptions. Another thing kind of that's really important to look at when we're doing impact maps is to kind of balance different types of value. There's at least 2 different types of value that we often have on IT projects. There's value for other people. We do this so that our users can do something better, faster, cheaper, easier, sooner. There's value for them. But we also do this software so that there's value for us. For example, this video tool I'm building, I can increase usefulness immediately by giving everything away for free. It's going to make the product much more useful, but it's not going to be successful because it's going to go bankrupt very quickly. I can make the product a lot more successful by overcharging for stuff I'm not charging at the moment. But that's not going to be that useful and people will leave. And finding a good balance between useful and successful is really important. So on an impact map, kind of things that are in the middle are usually things that are useful to somebody. That's describing the value for other people, but stuff kind of in the center of an impact map is really the value for us. That's kind of the success. And by visualizing that, we can argue about usefulness, successfulness. We can figure out how something here contributes to multiple levels of value. We can expose our assumptions about it and measure them and talk about this with our stakeholders in a much more effective way. So the next kind of interesting aspect of using impact maps that help us kind of achieve maximum impact with the minimum effort is not really to plan a backlog. I hate backlogs. Backlogs provide stupid commitment of stuff that might not need to be done ever because somebody put it there and all of a sudden it's a good idea for some reason. So what I like to do is approach a roadmap of things we want to create like a tournament. We don't have to deliver everything. What we need to do is succeed. We need to solve a problem. We don't need to deliver a solution necessarily. So kind of if we have a hierarchy, and that's why hierarchical roadmaps, hierarchical backlogs are important, we can make things compete with each other. I have a couple of ideas here. We can make them compete for the same impact. If we know that we need to do this 10%, and we have 20 ideas here, and the first idea gets us to 21%, let's not do the rest. Why would we do the rest? Likewise, if we have a bunch of kind of impacts here, and we want to grow mobile advertising. If this first thing grows mobile advertising like crazy, we don't need to do the other things. And one of the kind of really interesting effects of this is that for organizations that use impact maps to focus delivery, usually kind of they tend to achieve their goals in 5 to 10% of the planned scope, because it helps us very quickly find out and navigate and identify things that work, eliminate things that don't work, and avoid wasting time on things that are just kind of building software for no reason. So here's a couple of tips how you can debug your impact maps if you do them, and some common ways of people doing it wrong. So the first kind of thing that people often do wrong is they cheat with the goals. What they do is they put in the center of the map something that's not like a big success criteria or a big business value, or they put something that's kind of too much. It's too big. It's not really controllable, like a vision where we want to go in 10 years' time. So the best thing for an impact map is really to use the next milestone of your software product, next month, 3 months, 6 months, whatever the milestone is, and to put one business goal there. If you have multiple business goals you want to achieve in 3 months, create 3 different maps, put different goals there. So one of the things you definitely don't want to put there is a deliverable. Launching a mobile app, migrating to the cloud, those are things we do. And they might be important, they might be the most important thing in the world for you, but they're not a business goal. If a deliverable is there, that means that the business goal is still hidden. We didn't have a chance to talk about it, expose it, figure out how to measure it. So it's in some stakeholder's head. And by working back from that to actually figure out what the goal is, we can expose those assumptions much better. One of the best things about an impact map for me is that every connection here is an assumption. And it helps visualize and expose people's assumptions. Another thing that kind of shouldn't go into the goals are behavior changes. Especially when you work with UX people deal with behavior changes as goals. And they're going to say, our goal for the next milestone is to get people to stay 20% longer on the website, or to view 5% more pages, or something like that. Although that could be really important and critical, it is not a goal in this terminology. That's kind of an impact, that's a behavior change, and the goal is something else. The goal might be protecting revenue, or the goal might be reducing some kind of risk. And again, by exposing this, by really going through the process, we can visualize our assumptions so that we can measure it, we can test it, we can disprove it, and we can find a good solution for things. So related to this very closely is, try to map a milestone, not a millennium of work. I talked to too many people that have tried to do an impact map for the next 5 years of work, and then the impact maps are too big, too unwieldy. They can't be passed on to anybody because they're just too complex, and there's just people get lost in information. So what I would suggest is really focus on the next month of work. Focus on the next 2 or 3 months and figure out what are the impacts related to that. Only put deliverables for that there. If you really want to kind of focus delivery and be kind of pragmatic about this, then choose one impact that's the most important impact to achieve the goal, and only do stories and deliverables for that. You don't need to kind of map out all the other stuff. Do that first. When something else becomes the number one impact, then you can kind of map that out. And that's how we can avoid kind of the information overload. We can avoid working with millions and millions of things or hundreds of things, and kind of just work with 5 stories at a time and measure whether we're achieving that. So another kind of thing that's really interesting that we've heard from lots of people is that sometimes people have their pet features, and they want to put deliverables there, and these pet features don't really fit into the business goal, but they kind of go onto the map. And one of the key things about kind of deliverables on an impact map is these things should be kind of work items, but they need to be related to the impact. If somebody says, okay, in order to get people to come back more frequently, we're going to put Instagram integration. Well, then you can talk about how does Instagram actually help people come back more frequently to our website. It's not providing links there. You can't click on a link to come to the website. Yes, Instagram might be a good idea, but it's not related to this. And then we have an opportunity either create a different impact and figure out what is the value of this Instagram integration, or we can say, well, that doesn't belong to this map. It belongs to some other map. And it's a not now. Let's not do that yet. Let's move it to later. So kind of then one of the key things, and this really unlocks the whole power of everything, is figuring out the right impacts. That's why it's called an impact map. The most important part is in the middle. And to really be successful with impacts, the impacts have to be behavior changes, and they have to be related to a goal. Sometimes we've heard from people that kind of put stuff that they want to work on here. And that's kind of effectively deliverable. That's not an impact, which means that we don't really have a clear impact defined. We don't know how to measure the result of this. So something like enable users to generate their own reports. Well, you know, we're enabling people, that's what we do. And if that's kind of the outcome, we will always succeed on it. I will test the software. Am I enabling users? Yes, I've enabled users. But are the users actually using those reports for what they need to achieve? Are they changing their work based on those reports? That's a big question. So identifying the right impacts is really important. Plus, again, these impacts need to be related to the big goal. So in terms of looking at the impacts and things like that, what I would suggest is kind of try to avoid describing the capability for people to do something, or providing the ability, like would be able to, will be able to. Try to avoid talking about wants and needs, because these things are not really good as measurements, leading indicators of value. We can't measure them objectively. Before we implement software, people wanted to do something. After we implement software, people will still want to do that. And then the big question is, are we providing value? So from a perspective of 4 disciplines of execution, like having a good leading indicator of value, describing things like, oh, somebody does something differently, or somebody stopped doing something that they were doing and we don't want them to do it anymore, or started doing something we want them to do, gives you an objective measurement of value, gives you an objective assumption of value that you can then test and prove and disprove, gives you a way to navigate this stuff. So very quickly, kind of the final conclusion I want to leave you with: behavior changes are an excellent way to describe leading indicators of value. And if you remember one thing from this, for whatever next item you have of work in your backlog, in your plan, try to figure out, does it clearly describe a behavior change? If not, then talk to your stakeholders, figure out what the expected behavior change is. Very, very often, these things will describe a type of work or behavior, not a change in that type of work. And unless we know the expected change, we don't know the direction, how this is supposed to move. And if we don't know the direction, then we can't really evaluate whether we are solving a problem, not delivering a solution. So using impact maps to visualize all that is nice to have, but you don't have to do it. I think figuring out these leading indicators of value is a lot more important. Thank you very much for listening to me. For a couple of kind of links where you can find some more information, you can go to impactmapping.org. There's a ton of articles there and things like that. And you can get my slides now from this URL immediately. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thank you. You made a lot of buzz in our Slack channel, so there are some questions and comment. And we have some 7 minutes at least for a short Q&A. And yeah, so everyone says it makes so much sense, right? To know what impact I make, and faster, sooner, better, easier. That's we want also from the products we use. But somehow we still don't use it in our companies. So from your perspective, why such an obvious and valuable thing is still not incorporated in startups and the new companies and the more mature companies?
So Doug Hubbard talks about that in his book, How to Measure Anything. He talks about, I mentioned this already, people tend to measure what's easy to measure, not what's important. Because once we start looking at measuring value, often people say, oh, you know, we can't do that because we don't have access to these people. But not having access to those people is not a conclusion, it's a problem statement. So you've identified the problem, go and solve it. And another thing kind of people often say it's impossible. And I have this really good mental trick I've learned from a conference somewhere. I don't remember the speaker, but I've been using it ever since. Whenever I hear the word impossible, I replace it with too expensive. So, oh, it's impossible to talk to the users. Well, it's not impossible, it's too expensive. It might be expensive in terms of time, business risk, and things like that. How can we reduce that expense? Well, let's not talk to 500 people, let's talk to one person. And so what we need to do is we need to find leading indicators of value. We don't have to prove totally that we're getting all the value, but let's find an indicator. Let's sit next to 5 people and see if their behavior is changing and things like that. And the other reason why people are not doing this, even although it's obvious, is lots of people don't know about this trick with behavior changes. And I think that's kind of the really interesting thing. We use this, and this is what Don Ranitzer talks about in the book. The way how people approach, like, is this valuable or not, is they tend to ask the stakeholders, oh, is this valuable? And all you get is one person's random opinion. I mean, who cares? How do we know that this person's opinion is actually correct? And what are their incentives? And I think we need to find objective measurements of value if we really want to do this. Plus, that also helps those stakeholders, because those stakeholders don't know how to measure value. And it's not their job to know how to measure value. It's our job to help them do that. And going and asking them, like, is this valuable, is insane. But that's what everybody does.
Yeah, but then also, what would be your practical advice? So we have also in the audience, junior engineers, and they just like, wow, this will make so much sense. To whom you would suggest the junior engineer to go in the company to ask and say, hey, let's start doing it? Do you believe there is someone who should?
So I think like different companies have different organizations. Like very difficult to provide generic answers, but whoever is like providing requirements or ideas to develop, whoever's adding items to your task list, kind of work with them to define for every task the expected behavior change. Figure out whose behavior this is supposed to change and how. Because at the end of the day, if you deliver 3 months work of software and nothing changes for your users, that's pointless. So, figure out, and that's why I think, don't worry about impact maps, don't worry about kind of changing the process at all. Just figure out for the next work item you have, does it describe a type of work, or does it describe a change to that type of work? And my guess is that for most people in the audience, if you really look at the backlogs, you'll see that it usually describes either just a deliverable, no type of work, nothing what kind of where the users are, or if it's talking about anything related to users, it's talking about the type of work without showing the change that's expected to the type of work. And just kind of talking to people about what's the expected change is really, really critical. You don't have to have like a number. Yes, it's wonderful to say 20% faster, because then we can measure if we're getting there. But even if you just know it's supposed to be faster, you can measure if it is faster later. And then we can talk about, is it faster enough?
Yes, and then the last question, which also we had many discussions in the Slack channel, and people were sharing their experiences. The famous technical debt and those back-end changes that all engineers very often struggle to, I think, both understand why and also explain why they're needed. So maybe what would be your best examples of how companies, I don't know, and the engineers explain impact of those backend changes? Let's say it's a refactoring, the migration.
So backend changes might, whether something is in the backend or front end doesn't really matter. Backend changes can make things better, faster, easier, cheaper, more accurate. That's a totally different thing. So whether something is backend or front end, it doesn't really matter. But with kind of technical debt, that's a slightly different category. Some technical debt changes actually are there because there's hidden business value, but the business value is not expressed. And then we can work through that, we can figure it out, and we can express it in a different way. Some technical cleanup tasks are there to provide sustainability for the product. They're not there to deliver value to the users. And things like that really don't fit into an impact map because they're not about delivering value to the users, they're about sustainability for the company. And what I tend to do about that kind of stuff is just budget for it in work. And then it doesn't have to be competing with the other things. It doesn't have to be planned. It doesn't really have to be explained. It doesn't have to be prioritized. It can just be budgeted for. So people can say, look, 5% of our time we'll work on cleanup tasks. And then it doesn't need to be in the backlog. It doesn't need to be kind of discussed with product owners. Product owners don't have to have an opinion on it. You don't have to create an acceptance criteria. And I think it's important from a perspective of keeping the product sustainable. And from that aspect, you can talk to business users, stakeholders, product people, and say, well, do we need to keep this product sustainable in the long term or not? If not, maybe you're doing something that's one-off, like don't worry about technical cleanup. If yes, then the question is, what is your budget for sustainability? Perfect.
Thank you. Have a look at the Slack, and if you have any comments and answers.
Thank you very much for having me. Hopefully this kind of tickled people's imagination a bit.
Absolutely. You will see it.
Goodbye.
Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.